Hey everybody, Sarah Estabrooks here from To Jesus Sincerely, and today I would love to talk to you about the topic of virtues for moms. So when I was a young adult Catholic and really beginning to embrace my faith and call the Catholic faith my own, and start to live it out, and at the same time I was just married and just beginning to have kids, one of the things that really struck me was that I wanted to learn more and grow more about the virtues. I knew that I wanted to be a virtuous person, that I wanted to be holy, and I knew that there were these things called virtues. I could even probably name a bunch of them for you, but I didn't really know what it meant to intentionally practice those every day. And so that kind of became my mission, to learn about the virtues and to practice the virtues. And today I'd love to share with you just some of what I've learned along the way. So I want to help you answer questions like, what is a virtue? Why is it important that we practice the virtues? How do we pass them on to our children? And what are some tips for growing in the virtues? So let's dive in. So first of all, what is a virtue? When we think of the word virtue, we probably think of the good things we do or the things that make us holy. We may think of words like patience, kindness, and humility, and this is a really good start to the understanding of virtues, but I want to dive a little deeper in just a second. It's important that we know what the virtues are and that we can practice them so that we can pass them on and model them for our kids. I want to read you something from the Catechism. So, Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 2223. It's in the section on the duties of parents to their children, and here's what it says. Parents have a grave responsibility to give good example to their children. A grave responsibility means we better take this seriously, and we have to give this good example to our children, and that's what I want to unpack and unfold today. So this good example that we want to give our children is the virtues. We have this grave responsibility to live a virtuous lifestyle, to embrace the virtues, to practice them, to grow in them as much as we can. So let's dig a little bit deeper into what the virtues are. So I'm turning to the back of my catechism now, and I'm in the glossary, and it says a virtue is a habitual and firm disposition to do good. And then it goes on, there are two types of virtues. The moral virtues are acquired through human effort, aided by God's grace. The theological virtues are gifts from God. We're going to talk about those in a second, but let's go back. A habitual and firm disposition to do the good. So when I think of my habits, I have some habits that are good habits, like brushing my teeth before I go to bed. But I also have some habits that are not so good habits and may even be sinful habits. So the habits are the things that, we turn to and they're easy for us and they're just a part of our lifestyle. And we can build those habits, we can work on those habits, we can change those habits, but it can be a lot of work, especially if we have a bad habit that we have to overcome and get rid of. So a virtue is a habitual disposition and firm disposition to do the good. So these are habits of doing good. So doing good once or twice is not necessarily a virtue. It is still a good thing and it's a good start, and we have to start somewhere by doing a good thing once or twice and practicing it over and over. But it really becomes a virtue when it becomes a habit, when it becomes deeply ingrained in who we are and in how we live. So let's move on to the tips for growing in virtue, because sometimes maybe we know what's good and right and we want to do it, but we need to actually begin doing it and putting it into practice. So my first tip for growing in virtue is to build a virtue vocabulary. So to define our terms and know what we're talking about. So now we know what a virtue actually is. We also know that there are two types of virtues, the theological virtues and the moral virtues. So let's dive a little more deeply into that vocabulary and figure out what the theological and moral virtues are. So theological virtues are gifts from God. They are infused in us. They are freely given to us by God. So these are not the virtues that we practice or we work hard at or we acquire through human effort. These are the virtues that are given to each individual, and maybe in varying amounts and in different amounts by God. But what we can do is we can be more receptive to the theological virtues, because we aren't always fully receptive of all the gifts that God gives us, but we can become more receptive to the gifts that God gives us. Okay, So what are these theological virtues that are gifts from God? They are faith, hope, and charity. So faith is the virtue by which we believe in God and all that he has revealed. Hope is the virtue by which we trust in God and all of his promises. And charity is the virtue by which we love God above all else for his own sake and love our neighbor as ourselves. So you may have heard of the practice of making acts of faith, hope, and charity. This is a really good way to be more receptive to the gift of these virtues that God gives us in our lives. For example, praying, I believe in you, Lord, help my unbelief. I think that's originally the prayer of doubting Thomas, right? I believe, Lord, help my unbelief. That's an act of faith, and that'll help us be more receptive to the gift of faith. Or the act of hope, just saying, I hope in you, God, increase my hope. The act of charity, praying to God, help me love you more. Just making those acts of the will and saying those prayers and putting, our whole self into it is a way that we become more receptive to these gifts of God that he freely gives us in our lives. All right, so we know what faith, hope, and charity, the theological virtues, are. Let's talk about the moral virtues. So there are 4 virtues that we call the cardinal virtues, around which all of the moral virtues are kind of grouped. So the cardinal virtues are prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. So these virtues we can acquire by human effort, by practicing them, by trying to grow in them, I guess you can think of the metaphor or the analogy here of weightlifting. I don't do any weightlifting, but if you lift weights and you practice using your muscles, they're going to get stronger. And you're going to be able to lift heavier weights or whatever. Talk to the weightlifters, don't talk to me. But anyway, so prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude work this way. The more that we practice them, the stronger we are able to exemplify these virtues. So prudence is the virtue that helps us make good and moral decisions, to choose the good, to know the good, to desire the good, and to choose between good, better, and best in spiritual matters and in all matters of our lives. Justice is the virtue by which we give to God and others what they are due. So justice encompasses virtues such as the virtue of religion, and it encompasses things like giving to the poor because they deserve to have their basic needs met. So justice really is a virtue of giving rather than a virtue of like getting even. Sometimes I think of justice as getting even, but it's more of a virtue of giving to others what they deserve. Temperance is the virtue by which we moderate all our desires and make sure our desires are pointing towards God. Because every desire we have for something good points to this desire in our heart that can only be fulfilled by God. And fortitude is sometimes called holy courage, and it's the virtue of the martyrs. It's the virtue that helps us to be good witnesses of Christ in every aspect of our lives. So now we're growing our virtue vocabulary so that we understand these things, these qualities that we desire to practice and possess. You can find more about all of these virtues if you look in your catechism, which leads me to my second tip. Second tip for growing in virtue is to not only know what the virtues are and be able to name them, but to devote yourself to studying them. And this is what I did all those years ago when I decided that I really wanted to grow in the virtues. I began studying them because I wanted to understand them, what they really meant, and how to practice them. And so I have some recommendations for studying virtues yourself as a mom, and for studying the virtues with your kids. So you can just pick up your catechism and start reading the sections on the virtues. That is a great start. I would also love to recommend my book, Becoming Holy One Virtue at a Time. It's published by Our Sunday Visitor. You can find it on Amazon. And in that book, I go deeper into the theological and cardinal virtues and how to put those virtues into practice in your life. And it's a prayer journal, so there's a lot of room for questions, for thinking them out, for brainstorming, and for making a plan to practice those virtues in your life. And another resource that I would recommend is if you go on my website, tojesussincerely.com, you'll find my virtue challenge. It is free, and it has different virtues. It has over a year's worth, but the idea is to spend a year and to focus, to zero in on one virtue every month and to learn about that virtue, to study that virtue, and to really focus on practicing that one virtue, not to the neglect of the other virtues, but that one virtue in particular, just to kind of, it's like when you're, I guess, focusing on on growing one muscle at a time, right? Or you can't do it to the neglect of the others because you'll look ridiculous if you have one strong muscle and the rest of you is scrawny. But sometimes you have to zero in on one muscle and really learn how it works and how to use it and how to grow it. And that's kind of the idea of the virtue challenge, is to take one virtue at a time, learn about it, study it, really begin to embrace it and make it your own. So check out those resources for studying the virtues. And I also have some recommendations for studying the virtues with your kids. In particular, my favorite virtue program for kids is another free one from the Nashville Dominican Sisters. So just Google it, Nashville Dominican Sisters Virtue Study Program. I think it's called Virtues in Practice. It is really good. It is free. It goes through, it has like a bunch of virtues underneath the titles of the theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity. And it's for elementary kids, and then there's workbooks for like your pre-K, and then there's workbooks for your early elementary kids, there's workbooks for your 6th through 8th grade kids, and it leads you through the virtues. It explains them to the kids. It gives an example of a saint who practiced the virtue. And then it has exercises to help the kids think about the virtues and sometimes like role play or practice the virtues or read about the virtues or study the virtues. And I do that daily with my kids, and I highly recommend it for learning the virtues with the kids. Okay, naming the virtues and studying the virtues is not enough to be virtuous, okay? To be virtuous, we have to practice the virtues. We have to actually put them into place. So the next tip I want to make is that in order to be able to do this, we need to look at our lives and know what virtues we're practicing and what virtues we're not, what virtues we need to grow in. So my third tip here is to find some time every day for meditation, okay? Because the virtues, as I had mentioned before, are not just a self-help program. The virtues are really about our relationship with Christ. They're about being more Christ-like, about growing closer to Christ, about doing the good that He expects of us and requires of us. Excuse me. So in order to do that, we need to have some time to meditate and reflect on our relationship with Christ and how we're living in relationship to Him. So for me, what that looks like at this point in my life, in this stage in my life, is I set my alarm to get up about an hour earlier before my kids are gonna come rolling out of bed. And I spend that time with my Bible and with my prayer journal and with my pen, and I journal through a part of the Bible, and part of that meditation and morning prayer is, asking God, asking Jesus to give me the strength to live my vocation throughout the day, and thinking about the various challenges that I might encounter that day, and asking for His grace to really, to get through those, to practice virtue in the face of those challenges, and thinking through some of the situations that I'm going to be facing in the day, and how I want to tackle those and what virtues I really need His help practicing. So for me, morning meditation is the time that I get that time to reflect on my relationship with Christ, and how well, or maybe not so well, I'm practicing the virtues, and what my goals are, and what His goals are for me sometimes. Okay, but maybe this isn't practical for you, because maybe you're up all night nursing a newborn baby and it doesn't make sense for you to set your alarm an hour early. Or maybe you have teens in the house and they love to stay up late chatting about their day, and that's the only time you get to really connect with them, so you need that extra sleep in the morning. Your time for meditation doesn't have to look like mine, but I think that we all could use some time to intentionally build some quiet into our schedules and into our calendars, to pray and to meditate. So this could be just a few minutes when you normally listen to a podcast, or maybe you listen to music in the car, or you turn on the radio, or you put on a show when you have time to relax. Maybe replacing those times with just a few minutes of quiet. So perhaps while you're driving, turn off the radio and instead just reflect and let your mind turn to Christ and your relationship with Him, and reflect on the virtues in your life if that's what your goal is right now. Maybe while you're doing the dishes, instead of putting in a podcast, turning that off and doing the dishes, in silence, giving you that freedom to reconnect and to think over your relationship with Christ. Or even a few minutes while you're in the shower. I know sometimes they have those shower speakers, right, where you put on like a music or something and you sing while you're in the shower. Maybe instead of that, just taking the few quiet minutes that you might get in the shower to really pray on how and reflect on how you're practicing the virtues. And then to go and actually put into practice what you're praying about throughout your day. All right, so here's another tip. Sometimes we get caught up in ourselves and in our kids in recognizing the areas where we fail. So for example, in disciplining our kids and telling them what to do wrong and telling them what they should do instead. But this tip, I want to encourage you to recognize and name the virtues in others as well as in yourself. So catch your kids practicing virtue. It was really responsible of you to clean your room without even being asked. It was really charitable of you to help your sister and give her a Band-Aid when she scraped her knee. Or it was really studious of you to do all your work and get it done in a timely fashion, without me nagging you. Or maybe it was really humble of you to accept your discipline and to accept your punishment without arguing back. So it's really good to catch our kids doing good and exemplifying these virtues and putting a name to it. And not only focusing on the bad, but praising the good so that they can recognize these good qualities in themselves and feel proud of themselves for displaying these good qualities when we point them out. And in the same way, to recognize the virtues in yourselves and in others, in your friends who you want to learn virtues from. I want to make just a quick note about comparison, and I want to caution you about comparing yourselves with others. So it's really good to have role models, especially in the faith, people who we look up to, who are a good example to us, but sometimes I fall into the trap of looking at, I'll think of a particular friend who I'm not going to name, but I'll think of this example in my mind. I have a friend who's very patient with her children and very, very easygoing. And she always seems to respond very meekly to whatever situation gets thrown her way. And sometimes I think, I wish I were more patient like her. Or I don't know why I can't be patient like she is. And I think that this trap of comparison, it stops us from being able to learn from the other, and it also denies the good in ourselves of the way that God created us to be. And this is why I think that, because my friend who I'm thinking of is naturally a mild-mannered kind of person. She is very meek. She has an easygoing personality. So a virtue such as patience might not come difficult to her, but other virtues might be difficult to her. Whereas me, on the other hand, I'm a little bit more intense. I have a very outgoing personality, and I can be quick to excitement and I can be quick to frustration. So for me, patience isn't something that comes naturally, but other virtues do come naturally. For example, zeal for spreading the gospel, my love for others, my excitement to do good for others or to help others comes more naturally to me than other virtues such as patience. So I think that it's important that we don't compare ourselves with others in a way that denies the virtues within us, but that we look to others, for example, the saints and virtuous friends, as role models and examples to learn from, but that we also recognize the natural virtues in ourselves, and we recognize our own weaknesses and our strengths and what God wants us to learn from that. Another thing that I want to say is, in modeling virtues for your children, make sure to apologize when you fall and when you fail, because it's, we discipline our children a lot, but who's there to discipline us? Kind of we got to take that on our own for the most part. So if you do fail in a virtue, it's okay to name that, to say, I wasn't very patient when I yelled at you for not tying your shoes fast enough, or whatever it might be. and then apologize to your children, and then say, I'm trying to grow in patience, I'm trying to practice patience, but as you know, that's a virtue that is difficult for me sometimes. So thank you for being patient with me and forgiving while I try to practice this virtue. And I think that naming those virtues and recognizing those virtues when we practice them and when we fall can be really helpful in trying to grow in virtue ourselves and as a family. All right, so the last tip I have for you today for practicing virtue and growing in virtue is, I think that it's helpful to make a daily examen at the end of the day. So this is different from like an examination of conscience that you would make before confession. So in an examination of conscience, you specifically think about your sins and the things that you have done wrong and the things that you are sorry for. But in a daily examen, and you can look this up, just put it in Google, daily examen, maybe type in the word Catholic. Anytime I'm looking up something Catholic, I type in Catholic, just to make sure I'm not getting something funky and wacky. So you can search as daily examen, but basically what it is a thoughtful and reflectful review of your day. So you take a look at your day and how your day played out. You take some time to think about God's grace in your life throughout the day, the ways that you responded positively and you cooperated with God's grace. So for example, the ways that you practiced virtue throughout the day, and you celebrate and you thank God for those good moments. But then you also think about your failings throughout the day. And a lot of times I make an act of contrition when I do my daily examen, but then you also make a plan for how to move forward the next day. So if you notice a particular failing in your day, in your daily examen, then you make a particular plan as to what you're going to do differently tomorrow by God's grace to make a small step towards overcoming that failing in yourself. And I think that this just goes along the same lines of that self-awareness and that evaluating our relationship with Christ and the ways that we're drawing closer to Him and the ways that we keep ourselves from Him. So if you want to get really serious about practicing virtue in your life, I think that a daily examen can be really helpful. And in my virtue challenge, if you decide to go that route online, I do include a type of a daily examen that helps you reflect on that particular virtue and the ways that you may have grown or fallen in it in that day. All right, so I hope that some of those tips were helpful for you. And I just want to circle back to that paragraph in the Catechism that states that parents have a grave responsibility to give good example to their children. So I think that if we really take this seriously, about being intentional, about living a virtuous life, about practicing the virtues, that's going to go a long way towards instilling these virtues in our children. Practice what you preach. If you want to teach it, you have to model it. And so I think that it's important that we take the idea of practicing virtues seriously, that we make a real effort towards living virtuous lives. We're not going to be perfect. Nobody is perfect on this side of heaven, but with God's grace, we can make a real effort to live virtuous lives, and then we can grow in virtue throughout our lives, as we seek heaven and we seek the perfection that we'll attain in heaven as our final goal, and to also model and seek forgiveness when you fall, when you fail, and just be intentional about your goal. Once again, virtue is not a self-help program. It is a way to draw closer to Christ personally by being more like Him and by practicing these virtues that bring us closer to Him. So I think that virtues are really important for each of us as moms and for all of us to grow in as a family. So I hope that was helpful to you, and please know that I'm praying for you, and please pray for me as I try to pursue holiness in my vocation and pursue growing in virtue throughout my life. God bless.